Hi everyone. Today we're talking about chapters 7 through 12 of The Half-Blood Prince. So, the thing that stood out to me in this book so far is the depiction of class. And we've talked about this class before in the context of the Weasleys, specifically about how the series is a bit ambivalent, telling us repeatedly that they're poor, but showing us a fair amount of evidence that would suggest that they're more middle class. Some of you have suggested that maybe the wizarding community's class system is different from ours, such that the Weasleys occupy the lower end of a spectrum, even if they'd be middle class by Muggle standards, which I think is an interesting idea. But regardless, I've argued, along with a lot of other Harry Potter scholars, that the reason this series insists upon the Weasleys' relative poverty is that it's following the fairy tale trope of rich equals greedy and bad, and poor equals humble and good. We see this also with Lupin and Hagrid as poor or working class and good, and on the other side, the Malfoys and the Blacks as rich and bad. So, it's interesting that this book offers us so many characters who complicate this trope. And I want to start with a minor character before we work up to some of the more central depictions of class in this book. So, first, Stanley Shunpike. This is the third time Stanley's come up in these books. In Prisoner of Azkaban, he worked on the night bus. In Goblet of Fire, he was trying to chat up Avila at the Quidditch World Cup. And in this book, he's overheard discussing secret Death Eater plans in a pub and arrested. The trio is surprised that Stan's being taken seriously as a Death Eater. In Prisoner of Azkaban, we saw that he was terrified of Voldemort. He didn't want to say his name, he was very upset by him. And so the trio speculates first that maybe he's under the Imperius Curse, and then that maybe he was just trying to impress people. So their general impression is that Stan is harmless. But I think it's an interesting choice to plant this seed here. We know that Stan is one of the few distinctly working class characters in the series, with a strong working class London accent. We also learn from the Daily Prophet that he's 21, which would make him 18 in Prisoner of Azkaban. Given that Stan didn't recognize Harry in that book, despite Harry's fame within Hogwarts, not only is Harry the boy who lived, he was also the Gryffindor Seeker and rumored to be the heir of Slytherin. It would seem unlikely that Stan wouldn't recognize him if he had attended Hogwarts. So maybe working class witches and wizards don't go to Hogwarts. Maybe they begin work or apprenticeships instead. But what this means is that we have a young working class man without a lot of education, who no one takes seriously, who's physically characterized by his acne, and is remembered, by Ron at least, for his unsuccessful attempt to attract a beautiful woman. And he's being apparently radicalized by a mostly male, pure-blood supremacist group that may be offering him a sense of community and belonging that he's never experienced before in the wizarding world. So that's a very specific portrait, and it's one that has parallels to white supremacists and incel groups in the real world. And it is a far cry from the poor equals humble and good trope that we've seen. So what I'm wondering is whether we're meant to assume that other Death Eaters could also fit this profile. Clearly not all of them. We've seen upper-class elite Death Eaters in the form of the Malfoys and the extended Black family, and I think we've often assumed that they're representative. But they probably aren't. Just as we're seeing Dumbledore's inner circle in a way that we wouldn't have access to if Harry wasn't our narrative perspective, we may similarly be seeing the leadership class of the Death Eaters, which is going to be wealthy, powerful, educated people like Lucius Malfoy. It's very possible that the foot soldier Death Eaters are more like Stanley Shunpike. Or young Severus Snape. What we know about Snape so far suggests that he grew up in a poor and unhappy home. Unlike Stan, he definitely did go to Hogwarts, but he didn't seem to have had a happy time there either, despite being very bright. Snape was bullied by the rich, popular boys for his poverty and appearance, and we're going to find out that he loved a girl who wasn't interested in him. Both of these were such formative and negative experiences that Snape's still holding on to them and exacting revenge 20 years later. And it's easy to imagine that that combination of factors may have made him susceptible to Death Eater ideology that offered him both a community and also the chance to hold power over others outside that community, and to believe that whatever his economic class, at least he was superior to them. I am curious, though, how class affects Snape's position within the Death Eater organization now. If it's true that proximity to Voldemort and a place in the leadership ranks of the Death Eaters is not just a function of loyalty, but also of the usual indicators of power, including wealth, does it matter that Snape appears to still be relatively poor? When Narcissa and Bellatrix go to his home in Spinner's End, it's clear that this is a rundown neighborhood, possibly the same one where Snape grew up. And Bellatrix, for one, is not impressed. The text says, "He lives here?" asked Bella in a voice of contempt. "Here? In this muggle dunghill?" She does seem somewhat surprised, so maybe Snape's managed to keep his background to himself. But obviously Narcissa knows where he lives, and Wormtail's now living there too. Snape's even got several drinking goblets, so we might imagine that he occasionally entertains there. In short, it's not a secret. Which makes Bellatrix's next line really interesting. She says, "We must be the first of our kind ever to set foot." And she's cut off, but we can assume she was going to say ever to set foot here. But what does Bellatrix mean by first of our kind? They can't be the first from the wizarding community. Snape and Wormtail live there. She knows that. Narcissa is going to see Snape. There's literally why Bellatrix is chasing her. So whatever category our kind refers to is one that excludes Snape. It could be blood purity or class or both. My guess is a combination. I think our kind means the upper crust Death Eaters, the ones who are not just pureblood, but also from old money families. This may also explain some of Bellatrix's distrust and distaste for Snape. It's not just that his position at Hogwarts and his outward loyalty to Dumbledore makes him suspicious, it's also that he's from the wrong kind of family to be in the top ranks of the Death Eaters. And Bellatrix is a person who cares about this kind of thing. Of course, this is ironic, given the family that Voldemort himself comes from. To me, the pensive memory of the Gaunt family stood out as the most fascinating and disturbing chapter we read for today. If Snape and Stan are depicted as being from urban or industrial working class areas and joining the Death Eaters in the late 1970s and 1990s, respectively, then the Gaunt family represents a more rural poverty in the 1920s. And there's an obvious similarity in the way that Marvolo seems to feel that his blood status makes him superior in spite of his poverty. That may be a common attitude among poor or working class pureblood families, which would reflect a real-world history of upper-class, employer-class white people stoking racial animus in their white workers, such that white workers would feel that however poor they were, at least they were not black. Of course, the purpose of this was to prevent workers from joining together against their employers. So if this comparison holds, we might ask who the upper class whites are in this scenario. Is it the rich purebloods? And how would they stand to benefit from this? What would happen if poor purebloods joined together with muggle-born or half-blood witches and wizards? But to get back to the Gaunt family, they live in abject poverty. Marvolo is referred to as a tramp, and their house is so dilapidated that Harry's not sure if anyone lives there. All three are dressed in ragged clothes, and the text describes their bodies, homes, and possessions as filthy and squalid. We're told implicitly within the memory, and also more directly in Dumbledore's debrief with Harry, that the Gaunts are inbred as a result of their obsession with blood purity. And this lack of genetic diversity has led to mental instability as well as violence, which is directed at both Muggles and Merope. This combination of extreme rural poverty and mental instability caused by inbreeding reminded me pretty uncomfortably of some of the more insensitive portrayals of poor white Southerners or people from Appalachia that get played for laughs. But of course, Rowling's writing from a British perspective that may not be aware of these depictions. And similarly, I am much less well-versed in the context of England in the 1920s, but I can say that it's less than a decade after World War I and just before the start of the Great Depression. Outside of the church, there's not much of a social safety net in the Muggle world, and we see little evidence of one in the Wizarding world either. And even if one does exist, the Gaunt family probably isn't interested. In fact, their situation really highlights the potential isolation of magical people should they choose not to or find themselves unable to associate with other witches and wizards. We've seen that the majority of the magical community doesn't live in London or Hogsmeade, but in majority Muggle villages and towns, such that they might be one of only a few magical families in the area. But with the ease of travel and so many people employed by the ministry, you can have someone like Arthur, who lives outside the village of Ottery St. Catchpole, but sees his ministry colleagues from all over the country every day. Bob Ogden similarly apparates in and out of Little Hangleton and can be back in London with his colleagues instantly. But the Gaunts seem completely cut off from the rest of the wizarding world, except for when Morphin breaks the law by hexing Tom Riddle Sr., and Bob comes to call. So the only contact the Gaunts have with the rest of the magical community appears to be in the context of being controlled and punished by ministry officials whose economic status is higher, but whose blood status may not match the pure-blood Gaunts. Marvolo and Morphin reject the authority of the magical government, especially its authority to prevent them from harming muggles and policing Merope's blood purity, and they meet it with violence, just as Voldemort will eventually do with much greater success. We'll see more of Voldemort's background as the book goes on, and I want to keep thinking about how he's depicted in terms of class and what we might take from this stark departure from the series' earlier dichotomy of good poor people and bad rich people. Before I wrap up, I want to touch briefly on one more depiction of class in these chapters, which is Horace Slughorn. At first, Slughorn seems to be getting the classic fairy tale treatment. He's clearly someone who enjoys luxuries. There's a lot of velvet and fancy chocolate in his vicinity. And Slughorn's body, which the text never misses a chance to remind us is fat, seems to be signaling greed and a kind of sloth that's not so much laziness as it is too much comfort. He's also well connected to the country's rich and powerful, and all of this points to wealth and, by extension, moral weakness. But Slughorn describes himself as a poor old professor, and we know that he's actually squatting in these comfortable houses for a week at a time. Furthermore, a lot of his luxuries seem to be gifts from former students he's helped to place in important positions. So Slughorn has all the trappings and mannerisms of a wealthy old man, and maybe he would like to be wealthy, but I don't think it's actually clear that he is, nor are we sure at this point where he stands morally. And this moral ambiguity is part of what makes Slughorn such an interesting character, and the ambiguity of his class is a part of that. So that's all from me for now. I look forward to hearing from you.